I thought I survived the crash, until I saw my own body in the morgue. Chapter 1, The Last Memory. The fluorescent lights above me flickered with an irregular rhythm that made my skull throb. I blinked slowly, trying to piece together where I was and why everything felt so distant. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils as I attempted to sit up on what appeared to be a hospital gurney. "Easy there, Ms. Mitchell." A voice materialized beside me, though I hadn't heard footsteps approach. Dr. Harrison, according to his nameplate, peered down at me with kind but puzzled eyes. His silver hair was disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Fragments of memory crashed into my consciousness like shards of broken glass. Rain, torrential rain hammering against windshields, the hypnotic rhythm of wipers fighting a losing battle. Then headlights, impossibly bright, rushing toward me like fallen stars. The screech of tires on wet asphalt, the sickening crunch of metal folding like origami. "The accident," I whispered, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "My car." Dr. Harrison nodded gravely. "A severe collision on Highway 27. You're incredibly fortunate, Sarah. May I call you Sarah?" He didn't wait for an answer. The paramedics said it was one of the worst crashes they'd seen this year. "Frankly, it's miraculous you're here talking to me." I tried to remember more, but there was nothing after those blinding headlights. Just emptiness, like trying to recall a dream that slips away the moment you grasp for it. My hands moved instinctively to check for injuries, but I felt nothing. No pain, no bandages, no tender spots that would indicate trauma. How long was I unconscious? I asked. "About 18 hours, he replied, but something in his tone suggested uncertainty. "The emergency team worked extensively to stabilize you." A nurse appeared at the edge of my vision, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and gentle hands. She approached with a clipboard, but I noticed she kept her distance, using medical instruments to check my pulse and temperature rather than direct contact. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away. "Everything appears normal," she murmured to Dr. Harrison, though her frown suggested otherwise. "Vitals are stable." "What are you telling me?" I pressed, sensing undercurrents of confusion in their professional demeanor. Dr. Harrison exchanged a glance with the nurse before forcing a reassuring smile. "Just grateful you're with us, that's all. Sometimes miracles happen, Sarah. Sometimes people walk away from situations they shouldn't survive." But as he spoke those words, I caught something in his expression. A flicker of doubt, perhaps even fear. And for the first time since awakening, I wondered if surviving had been the miracle he claimed, or if something else entirely had occurred in those missing hours between the crash and consciousness. Chapter 2, Absent Reflections. The hospital bathroom felt colder than it should have. I splashed water on my face, expecting the shock of it to help clear the persistent fog in my mind, but the sensation seemed muted, as if filtered through layers of gauze. When I looked up to check my reflection, the mirror showed nothing but the beige wall behind me. I stepped closer, thinking steam or condensation was obscuring the surface. My hand reached out to wipe it clean, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement. Shadow, perhaps, or the suggestion of a figure. But when the mirror cleared, only the empty bathroom stared back. "Must be the trauma," I muttered, though the words felt hollow even to me. In the hallway, I attempted to make normal human contact. A young man in a wheelchair sat near the nurse's station, staring at nothing. I approached with what I hoped was a friendly smile. "Excuse me," I said, but he didn't respond. I tried again, louder this time. "Hello." Nothing. He continued staring straight ahead, as if I hadn't spoken at all. Perhaps he was deaf or heavily medicated. I moved toward an elderly woman, shuffling past with her walker. "Good morning," I offered cheerfully. She walked right past me without acknowledgement, close enough that I should have felt the brush of her hospital gown, but there was no contact, no recognition of my presence whatsoever. A creeping unease began to settle in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Trauma could affect social interactions, couldn't it? Maybe I was speaking too softly, or my body language was off. But deep down, a more disturbing possibility began to take root. I watched the nursing staff move through their routines and slowly became aware of a pattern. They would approach my general area, perform their duties, but never quite look directly at me. Their eyes would slide past, focusing on clipboards, monitors, anything but my face. Even when they spoke to me, their gaze remained slightly askew, as if addressing someone standing just behind my left shoulder. "This is impossible," I whispered to myself, but the words seemed to dissipate into the air without echo. An hour later, I stood in the same bathroom, again confronting the empty mirror. This time, I pressed both palms against the glass, leaning close enough that my breath should have fogged the surface. Nothing. No warmth, no condensation, no reflection of any kind. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Severe concussion could cause hallucinations. Psychological trauma might manifest in unusual ways. But as I stared into that impossible void where my face should have been, a terrible question began to form. What if I hadn't survived the crash at all? What if the miracle Dr. Harrison spoke of was something else entirely? Something that defied the natural order of things. The fluorescent light above flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the bathroom into darkness. In that moment of absolute black, I could have sworn I heard the distant sound of rain on metal and the echo of grinding brakes that had come 18 hours too late. Chapter 3. The Impossible Report. Dr. Harrison sat in his office at 2 a.m., surrounded by manila folders and the ghostly glow of his computer screen. The Sarah Mitchell case had kept him awake for the third consecutive night, not because of its complexity, but because of its impossibility. He pulled out the initial trauma report, handwritten in the emergency room's characteristic scrawl. The attending physician, Dr. Rodriguez, had documented severe cranial trauma, massive internal bleeding, and cardiac arrest lasting over 12 minutes. The time of death was clearly marked, 11:47 p.m. Yet the woman he'd spoken to that morning was undeniably alive, sitting upright, conversing normally, showing no signs of the catastrophic injuries described in these reports. Harrison had performed medicine for 32 years, had seen remarkable recoveries, but nothing that contradicted the fundamental laws of biology. He picked up his phone and dialed Dr. Rodriguez's home number. "Miguel, it's Harrison. I know it's late, but I need to ask about the Mitchell case from yesterday." There was a long pause. "The DOA from the highway accident? What about her?" "The woman is alive, Miguel. She's walking around, talking, completely coherent." Another pause, longer this time. "That's impossible, Richard. I signed the death certificate myself. Massive trauma, complete system failure. There was no brain activity for over 15 minutes. Then explain to me how she's sitting in room 314 asking about breakfast." Dr. Rodriguez's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know what game you're playing, but Sarah Mitchell died on my table. I performed the examination personally. The coroner took the body to the morgue around 1 a.m. Harrison's blood went cold. What did you say? The body was transferred to County Morgue. John Stevens signed for it. Richard, what the hell is going on over there?" The line went dead, leaving Harrison staring at contradictory documents that couldn't possibly describe the same person. The death certificate bore Rodriguez's signature and the county seal. The admission forms showed Sarah Mitchell as a living patient under his care. Both sets of paperwork were legitimate, both were properly filed, and both described completely different outcomes. He called the morgue. John Stevens, the night attendant, confirmed that Sarah Mitchell's body had been received and was currently in cold storage, awaiting family notification. When Harrison described the woman claiming to be Sarah Mitchell, Stevens laughed. "Doc, I've been doing this job for 20 years. Dead is dead. If you've got someone claiming to be Sarah Mitchell, you better check her ID, because the real Sarah Mitchell is in drawer 7, and she ain't going anywhere." Harrison hung up and stared at the reports again. Every instinct told him to dismiss this as administrative error, but he couldn't shake the memory of the woman's eyes, alert, intelligent, and somehow desperate, as if she were trying to convince herself of something just as much as convince him. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Instead of filing the inconsistency as a clerical mistake, he opened a new folder and marked it S. Mitchell case under review. Whatever was happening here, it demanded investigation, not dismissal. The fluorescent light above his desk flickered and died, leaving him in the pale glow of his computer screen, surrounded by impossible paperwork and questions that had no rational answers. Chapter 4. Impossible Memories. Dr. Elena Voss had built her reputation on understanding the labyrinthine corridors of trauma-affected minds. As the hospital's chief psychiatrist, she had guided countless patients through the aftermath of accidents, violence, and loss. But Sarah Mitchell's case defied every model in her extensive experience. "Tell me about the accident," Dr. Voss said gently, settling into her chair across from Sarah in the consultation room. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the space. Sarah's eyes grew distant. "I remember leaving the office late. It was raining, one of those sudden storms that make the roads treacherous. The windshield wipers could barely keep up." She paused, her brow furrowing with concentration. "But then it gets strange." "Strange how?" "I remember watching myself drive. Not like a memory, like I was floating above the car, seeing everything from outside." Sarah's voice took on an eerie certainty. The emergency response arrived at exactly 11:23 p.m. Officer Bradley was first on scene, followed by Ambulance Unit 47. Paramedic Chin established that there was no pulse, while his partner, Martinez, attempted CPR for 14 minutes and 37 seconds. Dr. Voss felt a chill run down her spine. These details were impossibly specific, the kind of information that appeared only in official reports. "How could you know these things, Sarah? You were unconscious." "That's what I keep telling myself, but I remember standing there watching them work," Chin said to Martinez. "It's no use. She's been gone too long." Martinez replied, "Give it 2 more minutes." They tried the defibrillator 3 times before calling it. The psychiatrist's pen had stopped moving across her notepad. She had reviewed the preliminary incident report before this session, and Sarah's account matched the official documentation with disturbing precision. Details that weren't released to families, timing that was recorded only in paramedic logs, conversations that no civilian should have heard. "Sarah, what do you remember about being brought to the hospital?" "I followed the ambulance. I watched them wheel the body into emergency. Dr. Rodriguez tried for another 20 minutes to restart the heart. At 11:47, he officially called the time of death." Dr. Voss's notepad slipped from her trembling fingers. The time of death wasn't public information. It wouldn't be released until the family was notified. Yet Sarah had recited it with the matter-of-fact precision of someone reading from official documentation. "How do you know that time, Sarah?" For the first time, Sarah's certainty wavered. I was there. I watched him write it on the chart. But that's impossible, isn't it? I mean, I'm here talking to you." Dr. Voss excused herself and immediately called the emergency department. Dr. Rodriguez confirmed every detail Sarah had described, including private conversations between medical staff that occurred while the patient was clinically dead. The implications sent ice through her veins. When she returned to the consultation room, Sarah was standing by the window, but her reflection wasn't visible in the glass. Dr. Voss blinked hard, certain it was a trick of the light, but the empty reflection remained. "Sarah," she said carefully, "I'd like to schedule some additional tests." But when she turned around, the room was empty. Sarah Mitchell had vanished as silently as she had arrived, leaving behind only the lingering scent of rain and the impossible memory of details that the dead shouldn't know. Chapter 5. The Detective's Questions. Detective Marcus Cole had seen enough crime scenes to develop an instinct for when things didn't add up. The Sarah Mitchell case felt wrong from the moment he opened the file, and meeting the supposed survivor only deepened his suspicions. He found her in the hospital cafeteria, sitting alone at a corner table. Other patients and visitors moved through the space, but they seemed to unconsciously avoid her section, creating a bubble of isolation that struck him as unnatural. "Ms. Mitchell?" "Detective Cole, Metro Police." He showed his badge and took the seat across from her without waiting for permission. "I need to ask you some questions about the accident." Sarah looked up with eyes that seemed older than her 32 years. "Of course, though I'm not sure how helpful I'll be. My memory is still fragmented." Cole opened his notepad, though he'd already memorized the details. "Let's start with the basics. You were driving alone on Highway 27, correct?" "Yes, I was coming home from work." "Actually, that's where we have a problem." Cole's voice took on the professional edge that had cracked countless lies over his 15-year career. "The accident scene shows clear evidence of 2 occupants in the vehicle. We found personal effects belonging to David Chun in the passenger seat, your fiancé, according to your emergency contact information." Sarah's face went pale. "David? No, he wasn't with me. He was supposed to meet me at home. We found his wallet, his phone, his jacket, all bloodstained, all in the passenger area of your vehicle." Cole watched her reaction carefully. "And Ms. Mitchell, we found 2 bodies at the scene." The color drained from her face completely. 2 bodies. Both were declared dead on arrival at the hospital. David Chun, 29 years old, massive trauma from impact. And Sarah Mitchell, 32, multiple internal injuries and cardiac arrest. He leaned forward. "So help me understand how you're sitting here talking to me." Sarah's hands began to shake. "There has to be some mistake. I remember driving alone. I remember the rain, the other car's headlights, but David wasn't." She stopped, her eyes growing unfocused. "Wait, there was something. A voice calling my name. Someone saying, 'Sarah, watch out.' But I thought it was the radio, or your fiancé trying to warn you about the oncoming vehicle." The memory hit her like a physical blow. Suddenly, she could hear David's voice, panicked and desperate, shouting her name as the other car crossed into their lane. She could see his hand reaching for the wheel, trying to help her swerve. The impact, the terrible moment of weightlessness, and then, "He was there," she whispered. "Oh God, David was in the car." Cole nodded grimly. The other vehicle fled the scene. "We're treating this as a hit and run with 2 fatalities. But here's what I don't understand, Ms. Mitchell. You're describing details about the accident scene that only investigators would know. You've mentioned specific procedures, timing, conversations between first responders. How is that possible if you were unconscious?" Sarah looked at him with growing horror in her eyes. "Detective, what happened to David's body?" "Same place they all go. County morgue, pending family notification and autopsy." He closed his notepad and studied her face. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone's lying, when they're confused, and when they're telling the truth. Right now, you're telling me things that shouldn't be possible to know. I'm going to ask you one more time. How did you survive an accident that killed both occupants of the vehicle?" Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to see him. I need to see David." "Ma'am, the bodies are evidence in an ongoing investigation." But she was already walking away, moving with a purposefulness that seemed to part the crowd around her. Cole tried to follow, but somehow lost sight of her in the hospital corridors, as if she had simply melted into the walls themselves. He returned to his car and radioed dispatch. "I need someone to check the morgue. Verify that Sarah Mitchell's body is still in storage." As he waited for confirmation, a terrible possibility began to form in his mind, one that challenged everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the thin line between them. Chapter 6. First Glimpse of Truth. The county morgue occupied a gray concrete building that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Sarah stood across the street for nearly an hour, gathering courage for what she knew would be a confrontation with impossible truth. The temporary medical credentials Dr. Harrison had issued gave her legitimate access, though she suspected he'd never intended for her to use them this way. Jerome Williams, the night attendant, was a man whose 20-year career had inured him to the disturbing nature of his work. He barely looked up when Sarah presented her credentials and requested access to the accident victims from Highway 27. Terrible thing, he muttered, leading her through sterile corridors lined with refrigerated storage units. Young couple, whole life ahead of them. Hit-and-run driver still on the loose, from what I hear. Sarah's footsteps echoed hollow on the linoleum. 2 victims, you said? David Chun and Sarah Mitchell. She was a journalist. He was some kind of accountant. Real shame. Jerome stopped before a wall of steel drawers, each marked with toe tags and case numbers. You're doing some kind of follow-up examination. Something like that. He consulted his clipboard and pulled handle 7A. This is the male victim. Massive trauma, but the body's in decent condition considering. The drawer slid open with a mechanical whisper. David's face was peaceful, unmarked by the violence that had claimed his life. His dark hair was still damp from the rain, and Sarah could smell the cologne he'd worn that morning, the morning that seemed like a lifetime ago. Around his neck was the chain she'd given him for his birthday, the one with their initials intertwined. And the female victim? Her voice barely qualified as a whisper. Jerome moved to drawer 7B. This one's more damaged. Impact trauma, multiple lacerations. Family identification might be difficult. He pulled the handle. The world stopped. The body on the steel table wore her face, her hair, her clothes from that final morning. The blue dress she'd chosen for the office meeting, now stained dark with blood. The silver bracelet she never removed, still clasped around a lifeless wrist. But it was the details that struck her like physical blows. The small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the birthmark on her collarbone, the engagement ring David had placed on her finger just 3 months earlier. Sarah looked down at her own hand. The ring was there, gleaming under the morgue's harsh lighting. She touched her left eyebrow and felt the familiar ridge of scar tissue. Yet there in the drawer lay an identical version bearing the same marks, the same features, the same jewelry. Impossible, she breathed. Jerome, busy with paperwork, didn't notice her distress. What's that, Doc? She forced herself to look closer. The injuries were severe. A depression in the skull that spoke of massive trauma. Lacerations that painted a story of violent impact. This body had clearly died in tremendous pain. Yet Sarah felt nothing but a strange, distant sadness, as if observing the remains of someone she had once known well, but hadn't seen in years. When was this body brought in? Early this morning, around 1 a.m. Dr. Rodriguez signed the death certificate at 11:47 p.m. yesterday. Jerome glanced at the body with professional detachment. Poor thing probably never knew what hit her. Sarah reached toward the corpse's face, then stopped inches away. Some instinct warned her against contact, though she couldn't articulate why. Instead, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. The body's chest was rising and falling in an almost imperceptible rhythm. "Jerome," she said carefully, "is it normal for bodies to show respiratory movement after death?" He looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" But when they both looked at the body, it was perfectly still. Sarah was certain she'd seen movement, but now the corpse lay with the absolute stillness that only death could bring. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just the lighting playing tricks." She signed out and left the morgue, but not before taking one last look at the impossible sight in drawer 7B. As the steel door slid shut, she could have sworn she heard the faint sound of her own voice, calling from inside the darkness, pleading for someone to let her out. Chapter 7, Desperate Denial. Sarah fled the morgue, her sanity fragmenting like glass under pressure. The logical mind that had made her a successful investigative journalist scrambled desperately for rational explanations. Mistaken identity, administrative error, some kind of elaborate hoax, anything but the impossible truth that was slowly crystallizing in her consciousness. Back at the hospital, she cornered Dr. Harrison in his office. He looked up from his paperwork with the weary expression of a man who'd been expecting this confrontation. "Dr. Harrison, I need you to explain something to me." Sarah's voice carried the edge of barely controlled panic. "I've just been to the county morgue. There's a body there that they claim is Sarah Mitchell." Harrison removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Sarah, I think we need to discuss your psychological state. Trauma can cause. Don't. She slammed her palm on his desk, and both of them jumped at the sharp crack of sound. Don't patronize me with textbook psychology. I saw my own body lying in that morgue drawer. I saw injuries that should have killed me. I saw a death certificate with yesterday's date. Now tell me how that's possible. For a long moment, Harrison said nothing. Then he opened a thick manila folder and spread its contents across the desk. Medical reports, incident documentation, photographs from the accident scene. The images were brutal. Twisted metal, broken glass, and two bodies that had clearly suffered catastrophic trauma. The woman in that photograph, Harrison said quietly, is Sarah Mitchell. The death certificate is legitimate. The injuries were fatal. By every measure of medical science, Sarah Mitchell died at 11:47 p.m. on October 15th. Sarah stared at the photographs, seeing her own broken form amid the wreckage. Then who am I? I don't know. The honesty in his voice was more terrifying than any deception could have been. Sarah grabbed her phone and began dialing frantically. Her sister in Portland, her editor at the newspaper, her best friend from college. Every call went straight to voicemail. Every voice she reached was a recording. They'll call back, she told herself. People are busy. She left the hospital and drove to her apartment complex, using muscle memory to navigate streets that seemed somehow unfamiliar. But when she reached the building she called home for 3 years, she found new locks on the door. Through the window, she could see furniture that wasn't hers, personal belongings that belonged to strangers. At the rental office, the manager, a woman Sarah had spoken with dozens of times, looked at her with polite confusion. I'm sorry, but we don't have any tenant by that name. This unit was vacated last week after a tragic accident. The previous tenant passed away. But I'm Sarah Mitchell. I live here. I've been paying rent for 3 years. The manager's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Ma'am, are you feeling all right? Should I call someone for you? Sarah ran to her car, her breathing shallow and rapid. She drove to the newspaper office where she'd worked for 5 years, but her ID card wouldn't open the security doors. Through the glass, she could see her desk, now occupied by someone else. Her nameplate was gone. Her personal items had vanished. In the parking lot, she called her editor's direct line. Sarah Mitchell, I'm sorry. I don't know anyone by that name. Are you sure you have the right number? The voice belonged to Tom Bradley, a man who'd been her mentor and friend for years, but he spoke to her with the polite distance reserved for strangers. She sat in her car as the sun set, surrounded by the ruins of a life that seemed to have been erased. Every connection she'd built, every relationship she'd maintained, every trace of her existence had been wiped clean. Yet she could remember every detail, every conversation, every moment of a life that apparently had never happened. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Some questions don't have answers the living can understand. Meet me at Riverside Cemetery tomorrow at midnight. Come alone. A friend. Sarah stared at the message until the screen went dark, leaving her reflected in the black mirror of the glass. But just like every other reflection she tried to find that day, she saw nothing at all. Chapter 8. Reunion with the Dead. Riverside Cemetery at midnight was a landscape of shadows and moonlight, where weathered headstones stood like silent sentinels over the sleeping dead. Sarah walked among the graves with footsteps that seemed to make no sound, following an instinct she couldn't name toward a section of newer plots. She found David sitting on a marble bench beneath an ancient oak tree, staring at 2 fresh graves marked with temporary markers. He looked exactly as he had in life, no injuries, no signs of the trauma that had killed him. When he saw her approaching, his face broke into the familiar smile that had been her anchor through 3 years together. I was hoping you'd come, he said softly. I've been sitting here trying to make sense of what's happening to us. Sarah rushed to embrace him, expecting the solid warmth of his body, but contact brought only a strange, electric tingling, as if she were hugging a memory-given form. Yet it was unmistakably David, his scent, his presence, the way he held his shoulders when he was troubled. David, what's happening? I've been to the morgue. I've seen our bodies. But we're here. We're dead. The word hung between them like a physical weight. I know. I've seen my own body too. I watched them zip me into a bag and load me into the coroner's van. They sat together on the bench, two impossible beings contemplating their own impossibility. David took her hand, or performed the ghost of taking her hand, and she felt a connection that transcended physical touch. I remember the moment, he continued. The other car coming toward us, trying to warn you. The impact. Then there was this sensation of floating, like being pulled upward. But instead of going wherever we were supposed to go, we just stayed. How long have you been aware? Since about 6 hours after the accident. I woke up in the morgue, which was not an experience I'd recommend. His attempt at humor carried a note of hysteria. I tried everything, talking to people, moving objects, proving I was still here. But it's like we exist in a space between spaces. Sarah looked at the temporary grave markers. One read David Chun, beloved son and fiancé. The other, Sarah Mitchell, devoted daughter and journalist. Fresh flowers lay on both plots, testament to grief from families who believe them gone forever. Our families think we're dead, she whispered. We are dead, Sarah. Whatever this is, he gestured to their forms. It's not life as we knew it. A cold wind rustled through the cemetery, carrying with it whispers that might have been voices or might have been imagination. Sarah shivered, though she wasn't sure she could actually feel cold anymore. Why us, she asked. Why didn't we move on, or cross over, or whatever's supposed to happen? David's expression darkened. I've been thinking about that. The last thing I remember clearly was working on that corruption story you were investigating. The municipal contracts, the shell companies, all those irregularities I found in the accounting. Sarah's head snapped up. The Aldrich investigation. I was supposed to publish it this week. What if the accident wasn't an accident, Sarah? What if someone wanted to stop that story from coming out? The implication hit her like a physical blow. Murder. They hadn't died in a random traffic accident. They'd been killed to silence an investigation that threatened powerful people. And somehow, that unfinished business, the demand for justice, had anchored their souls to the world of the living. We need proof, Sarah said, her journalistic instincts overriding the impossibility of their situation. David smiled, the first genuine expression of hope she'd seen from him. Then it's a good thing ghosts can go places the living can't. Above them, clouds parted to reveal stars that seemed closer than they should have been, as if the boundary between earth and sky had grown thin. In the distance, a church bell tolled midnight, though the sound seemed to echo from several directions at once. They had died, but they had not departed. Now they had to discover why, and ensure that their deaths would not be meaningless. Justice, they realized, might be the key to finding peace, both for themselves and for the truth they died trying to expose. Chapter 9, The Believer. Detective Marcus Cole had solved murders, missing persons cases, and conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of city government. But nothing in his 15-year career had prepared him for the impossibility of the Sarah Mitchell case. Sleep eluded him as he sat in his apartment at 3 a.m., surrounded by case files and empty coffee cups, trying to construct a rational explanation for the irrational. The facts were simple and contradictory. 2 people died in a car accident. Their bodies were in the morgue, yet one of them was walking around, providing information that only crime scene investigators possessed. Either Sarah Mitchell had somehow survived death itself, or Cole was losing his mind. He'd consulted with Dr. Elena Voss earlier that evening, sharing his growing suspicions about the case. The psychiatrist had been unusually shaken during their conversation, admitting that Sarah's session had left her questioning fundamental assumptions about consciousness and mortality. She knew things, Voss had said. Her usual professional composure cracked. Details about her own death that weren't public knowledge. Medical procedures she couldn't have witnessed while unconscious. It's as if she was observing from outside her own body. Cole had heard of out-of-body experiences, near-death phenomena, but those typically involve survivors, not the deceased. He'd started researching similar cases online, diving into databases of unexplained phenomena, and found a disturbing pattern. Over the past decade, there had been 17 cases in their city involving traumatic deaths, followed by sightings of the deceased. Most were dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations or false identifications. But when Cole cross-referenced the locations, he found something that made his blood run cold. All 17 incidents had occurred within a 5-mile radius of a specific geographic area, the industrial district where several major city contracts were being fulfilled. The municipal corruption story that Sarah Mitchell had been investigating centered on those same contracts. At dawn, Cole made a decision that would either solve the case or end his career. He called Dr. Rebecca Stone, a former forensic psychiatrist who'd left mainstream practice to study what she termed consciousness anomalies, cases where the boundary between life and death appeared to blur. Dr. Stone arrived at Cole's apartment within 2 hours, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. Her reputation in academic circles was stellar, though her current research into paranormal psychology had made her something of an outsider. "Tell me about the Mitchell case," she said without preamble. Cole laid out the facts: the impossible survival, the contradictory medical records, the detailed knowledge of post-mortem events. Dr. Stone listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes in a leather journal. "I need to meet her," Stone said finally. "And Detective, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that everything you think you know about life and death is incomplete." That evening, they found Sarah at the cemetery where Cole had somehow known she would be. She sat beside David Chun on a marble bench, both figures clearly visible in the moonlight, yet somehow insubstantial, like projected images overlaid on reality. Dr. Stone approached without fear, her voice calm and professional. "Sarah, David, I'm Dr. Rebecca Stone. Detective Cole asked me to speak with you about your current situation." Sarah looked up with eyes that held depths of sorrow and confusion. "You can see us both." "Yes, and I believe I can help you understand what's happened." Stone settled onto the grass before them, creating an intimate circle in the darkness. "You're experiencing what I call a consciousness anchor. Your awareness has remained tethered to this plane despite physical death. It's rare, but not unprecedented." David leaned forward. "Are we ghosts?" "That's a simplistic term for a complex phenomenon. Your essential selves, consciousness, memory, personality, have maintained coherence after bodily death. This typically occurs when there are powerful unresolved issues keeping you bound to this existence." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "We think we were murdered. Someone wanted to stop our investigation into municipal corruption." Dr. Stone nodded gravely. "Violent, unjust death combined with important unfinished business. That's exactly the type of circumstance that can create consciousness anchoring. But Sarah, David, you need to understand, this state is temporary and potentially dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Cole asked. "Consciousness that remains anchored without proper resolution begins to degrade. They're being slowly consumed by the energy required to maintain coherence. Eventually, they'll face complete dissolution, not death, but absolute non-existence." She looked at Sarah and David with compassion and urgency. "You have perhaps days, not weeks, to resolve what's keeping you here." The implications settled over them like a shroud. Sarah and David weren't just dead, they were racing against a countdown to oblivion itself. Their only hope was to uncover the truth behind their murder and ensure justice was served before their consciousness dissolved forever. "Then we need to move fast," Sarah said, her voice carrying the determination that had made her a formidable investigative journalist. "Someone killed us to silence our story about municipal corruption. We need to prove it." Dr. Stone stood, brushing grass from her coat. "I'll help however I can. Detective Cole, are you prepared to investigate a murder where the victims are the primary witnesses?" Cole looked at the impossible pair sitting before him and made a choice that would define the rest of his career. Let's catch a killer. Chapter 10, The Medium's Warning. Dr. Rebecca Stone's office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian mansion, its windows offering a view of the city that seemed appropriate for someone who studied the spaces between life and death. The room was lined with academic journals, research papers, and books whose titles suggested investigations into phenomena that mainstream science preferred to ignore. Sarah and David had followed Stone and Cole there, moving through the city streets like shadows given substance. They could interact with the physical world in limited ways. Opening doors required tremendous effort. Moving objects left them drained, but observation and communication seemed almost effortless. Stone settled behind her desk, pulling out a thick folder filled with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. I've been tracking consciousness anchoring cases for 15 years. What you're experiencing isn't unique, though it's exceptionally rare. She spread photographs across the desk, images of accident scenes, crime scenes, locations where traumatic deaths had occurred. In every case, the anchoring occurs when violent death intersects with powerful unfinished business. The consciousness refuses to depart until that business is resolved. David studied the photographs. How many people have experienced this? In my documented research, 47 cases over the past 2 decades. Of those, 31 eventually found resolution and were able to transition peacefully. 16. She paused, her expression darkening. 16 waited too long. Their consciousness degraded to the point of complete dissolution. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. What does that mean exactly? Absolute non-existence. Not death, oblivion. The complete erasure of everything that made them who they were. No afterlife, no reincarnation, no continuation of any kind. Just nothing. The weight of that possibility settled over them like lead. Cole shifted uncomfortably in his chair. How long do they have? It varies based on the strength of the anchoring and the individual's will to exist. Given the intensity of your situation, a double murder designed to prevent exposure of corruption, I'd estimate you have perhaps a week before the degradation becomes irreversible. Stone moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew another folder, this one marked with Sarah's name. I've been researching your investigation into the municipal contracts. The corruption runs deeper than you realized and involves people with enough power to orchestrate murders and cover them up. She spread documents across the desk, contracts, financial records, corporate filings that painted a picture of systematic fraud involving millions of dollars in city funds. At the center of the web was Mayor Thomas Aldrich, a man whose political career had been built on promises of fiscal responsibility and government transparency. Aldrich has been funneling city contracts to shell companies he secretly controls, Stone explained. The money gets laundered through several layers before ending up in offshore accounts. Your investigation was getting close to exposing the entire network. David leaned closer to examine the financial records. I remember seeing irregularities in the accounting, but I hadn't connected all the pieces yet. According to my research, you and Sarah were scheduled to meet with the whistleblower the night you died. Someone from inside Aldrich's organization who was ready to provide direct evidence of the corruption. Sarah's memory stirred. Patricia Vaughn. She was Aldrich's deputy finance director. She'd agreed to provide documents proving the fraud. Ms. Vaughn died in a gas leak explosion at her apartment 6 hours after your accident. The authorities ruled it accidental, but the timing is remarkably convenient. The scope of the conspiracy became clear. 3 murders disguised as accidents, all designed to protect Aldrich's criminal empire. But the killers had made one crucial mistake. They hadn't anticipated that Sarah and David would remain conscious after death, able to bear witness to their own murder. Stone walked to the window, gazing out at the city lights. There's something else you need to understand. The longer you remain anchored, the more you'll be able to influence the physical world. But there are other entities that hunt consciousness anchors, beings that feed on the energy of souls trapped between planes. As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. The lights flickered, and shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. Sarah felt a presence pressing at the edges of her awareness, something hungry and predatory that had noticed their existence. We need to work quickly. Stone said, her voice urgent. Time is running out in more ways than one. Outside the window, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, and Sarah could have sworn she heard the sound of rain beginning to fall. The same rain that had been falling on the night they died. Chapter 11, Unfinished Business. The revelation that their deaths were murder rather than accident transformed Sarah and David's situation from tragedy to mission. They spent the following day, if day and night still held meaning for the dead, reconstructing the final pieces of their investigation with Stone's help and Cole's police resources. Sarah's apartment, now occupied by strangers, had been cleaned out with suspicious efficiency, but David remembered copying critical files to a secure cloud server before their final meeting. The challenge was accessing those files without physical presence, a limitation they were learning to work around through increasing influence over electronic systems. Focus your consciousness, Stone instructed as they gathered around Cole's laptop in the detective's apartment. Your anchoring gives you a connection to electromagnetic fields. Channel that energy. Sarah placed her incorporeal hand over the keyboard, concentrating with an intensity that made her feel as if she were burning energy she couldn't afford to lose. Slowly, letters began appearing on the screen as the computer responded to her will. Login. Chin_secure password. Sarah hand 4 of her. The files opened like a window into their past lives. Months of meticulous investigation condensed into spreadsheets, photographs, recorded conversations, and email chains that mapped the full extent of Aldrich's corruption. The scope was staggering. $12 million diverted from public housing projects, infrastructure improvements, and social services into a network of shell companies controlled by the mayor and his associates. Cole whistled low as he scrolled through the evidence. This is enough to send Aldrich to federal prison for the rest of his life. Why didn't you publish this while you were alive? David's image flickered slightly, a sign. Stone had warned that his consciousness was weakening. We needed one more source. Patricia Vaughn had promised to provide internal memos that would prove Aldrich's direct involvement. Without those documents, his lawyers could claim he was unaware of what his subordinates were doing. And now Patricia Vaughn is dead too, Sarah added bitterly. Stone had been quietly studying a photograph from the accident scene. There's something else. The vehicle that hit you. It was reported stolen 3 hours before the crash. The theft report was filed by Marcus Thorne, a man with connections to several private security firms that have done contract work for the city. Cole ran Thorne's name through the police database. Marcus Thorne, age 45, ex-military, currently employed by Blackstone Security Solutions. Clean record officially, but there are whispers about wet work, professional elimination. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Aldrich had hired Thorne to eliminate Sarah and David before they could expose the corruption. The staged car theft provided plausible deniability. The hit and run was designed to look like a random tragedy, and Patricia Vaughn's accidental death removed the final witness. But they'd underestimated the power of unfinished business to transcend death itself. We need to confront Aldrich, Sarah said. Make him confess. Get it on record. Cole shook his head. Even if we could record a confession, no court would accept testimony from dead witnesses. We need physical evidence that living people can present. David's form was becoming increasingly translucent. I could feel myself fading. We're running out of time. Stone consulted her notes. There might be another way. Consciousness anchoring sometimes allows for temporary possession of willing subjects. If Detective Cole were to agree, one of you could potentially inhabit his body long enough to confront Aldrich directly. The detective looked skeptical. Possession? Like in horror movies? Nothing so dramatic. More like sharing space. Your consciousness would remain in control, but Sarah or David could communicate through you, access their memories, provide guidance. It's risky. The energy cost could accelerate their degradation, but it might be our only option. Sarah looked at David, seeing her own desperation reflected in his fading features. They had perhaps hours before their consciousness began to dissolve irreversibly. If they were going to achieve justice, it had to be now. Do it, she said. "But we go after Thorn first. Get him to confess, then use that confession to pressure Aldrich." Cole took a deep breath, making a decision that defied everything he'd been taught about reality. "Tell me what I need to do." Outside, thunder rolled across the city like the growl of some immense predator, and the storm that had been building since their death began to break in earnest. The dead were about to wage war against the living, fighting for justice from beyond the grave. Chapter 12. The Conspiracy Unveiled. Marcus Thorn lived in a fortress-like compound on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by security cameras and motion sensors that spoke to a man with powerful enemies. But electronic surveillance meant little to beings who existed as conscious energy rather than physical form. Sarah and David moved through the compound's defenses like smoke through a chain-link fence, observing Thorn as he went about his evening routine. He was a man in his 40s, built like a soldier, with the careful movements of someone always prepared for violence. In his home office, they found evidence of his true profession: untraceable phones, encrypted communication devices, and a gun safe that contained weapons far beyond civilian legal limits. Cole waited in his car a half-mile away, wearing a wire that Stone would monitor from her office. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Sarah would attempt temporary possession, using Cole's body to confront Thorn, while David provided tactical support, and Stone ensured the entire encounter was recorded. "Are you ready?" Stone's voice crackled through Cole's earpiece. The detective gripped his steering wheel, knuckles white with tension, as ready as anyone can be for something impossible. Sarah's consciousness reached toward Cole, and he felt a sensation like ice water flooding his veins. For a moment, there were two minds inhabiting one body, his own thoughts overlaid with Sarah's memories, her knowledge, her burning desire for justice. "Can you hear me?" Sarah's voice echoed in his mind. "Yes," Cole whispered. "It's unsettling. Focus on the mission." Thorn is in his office on the second floor. He's armed, but he won't expect a direct confrontation. Cole approached the compound, using his police credentials to convince the security guard that he was following up on a routine investigation. The guard, a young man who clearly hadn't been briefed on the need to refuse police access, waved him through. Inside the house, Cole felt Sarah's consciousness, guiding him toward the office. Her knowledge of the layout was perfect. She and David had been surveilling the property for weeks before their death, building a case against Thorn's employer. They found Thorn at his desk, cleaning a pistol with the methodical care of a professional. He looked up as Cole entered, and his eyes narrowed with the instant recognition of a predator identifying a threat. "Detective Cole," Thorn said calmly. "I wasn't expecting a visit. What can I do for you?" Cole felt Sarah's rage burning through their shared consciousness, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "I'm investigating the hit-and-run accident that killed Sarah Mitchell and David Chen. Your vehicle was reported stolen around the time of the incident." Thorn's laugh was cold and calculated. "That's right. Terrible thing, having your car stolen. I filed the report immediately, as any law-abiding citizen would." "He's lying," Sarah's voice hissed in Cole's mind. "David is in the room. He says Thorn's pulse just accelerated. He knows we're onto him. Funny thing about that report," Cole continued, "the timing is remarkably convenient. Your car gets stolen, then shows up at a fatal accident, then disappears again, almost like it was planned." Thorn set down the pistol, but kept his hand near it. "Are you accusing me of something, detective?" Cole felt Sarah's memories flooding through him. Months of investigation, documented patterns of corruption, evidence of Thorn's connection to Aldrich's network. When he spoke again, it was with Sarah's knowledge backing every word. "I'm saying that Sarah Mitchell and David Chen were getting close to exposing Mayor Aldrich's corruption scheme. I'm saying they were murdered to protect a $12 million fraud, and I'm saying you're the one who killed them." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Electronics began to malfunction. Thorn's computer screen flickered, lights dimmed, and the security system started issuing false alarms. David's presence was growing stronger, his rage at his own murder manifesting as electromagnetic interference. Thorn reached for his gun, but the weapon wouldn't respond. David's consciousness had somehow interfered with the firing mechanism, leaving the assassin holding useless metal. What the hell? Tell me about the contract, Cole pressed, Sarah's determination driving him forward. Tell me who paid you to kill them. The office erupted in chaos. Every electronic device activated simultaneously. Computers, phones, televisions, security monitors, all blaring different sounds in a cacophony of supernatural fury. The lights strobed wildly, and papers whirled through the air as if caught in a cyclone. Thorne, a man who'd faced combat and killed without hesitation, looked genuinely terrified for the first time in his adult life. This isn't possible. Now, Sarah commanded. Press him now while he's off balance. The dead don't rest easy when they've been murdered, Cole said, his voice carrying an otherworldly authority. Sarah Mitchell and David Shun want answers. Tell me who hired you, and maybe they'll let you live. The poltergeist activity intensified. A framed photograph of Thorne with Mayor Aldrich flew off the wall and shattered at the assassin's feet. The message was clear. They knew about the connection. Thorne's professional composure finally cracked. Aldrich. Mayor Aldrich hired me. Said the reporters were getting too close. Needed to be eliminated before they could publish. He paid me $200,000 to make it look like an accident. Cole felt Sarah's consciousness surge with triumph. Got him. That confession is being recorded, but their victory was short-lived. The energy required for the possession and poltergeist activity was draining Sarah and David rapidly. Cole could feel Sarah's presence weakening, her consciousness beginning to flicker like a candle in strong wind. We need to get to Aldrich, she whispered in his mind, before it's too late. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, lightning illuminating the compound with stroboscopic intensity. The dead had gotten their confession, but the mastermind behind their murder was still free, and time was running out. Chapter 13. The hunt intensifies. The recording of Thorne's confession should have been the end of the investigation, but Mayor Thomas Aldrich had spent 20 years in politics learning how to survive scandals. Within hours of Cole's confrontation with the assassin, the detective found himself suspended pending an internal investigation into irregular procedures and possible psychological breakdown. Sarah and David watched from the edges of existence as their final hope for justice seemed to slip away. Their consciousness was fading rapidly. David's form was barely visible even to Sarah, and she could feel her own awareness becoming increasingly fragmented. Dr. Stone met them at the cemetery, where this phase of their existence had begun. The researcher looked haggard, her academic composure cracked by the weight of what she'd witnessed. Aldrich is moving fast, Stone reported. Thorne has recanted his confession, claiming he was coerced through psychological torture. The mayor's people are painting Cole as a detective who suffered a psychotic break after exposure to trauma victims. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The effort of the possession had cost her dearly, and she could feel pieces of her consciousness dissolving like sugar in water. David was even worse off. His form flickered in and out of visibility, and when he spoke, his words seemed to come from a great distance. How much time? Stone consulted her notes, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Hours, perhaps less. The energy expenditure from yesterday accelerated the degradation beyond my calculations. The terrible irony wasn't lost on any of them. They had obtained the proof they needed, but the system they tried to expose was protecting itself by discrediting the only living person who could present that proof. Aldrich would survive, the corruption would continue, and Sarah and David would dissolve into nothingness with their mission unfulfilled. But the mayor had made one crucial error. He'd underestimated the fury of the dead. As Sarah felt her consciousness fragmenting, she experienced a moment of absolute clarity. The evidence existed. The truth was documented. The confession had been recorded. What they needed wasn't another confrontation. What they needed was a way to disseminate that information beyond the reach of political influence. Stone, she managed to whisper. Your recording equipment, can it interface with broadcast systems? The researcher's eyes widened with understanding. You want to hijack the airwaves? Sarah, that would require enormous energy expenditure. It could destroy what's left of your consciousness instantly. David's fading voice joined the conversation. Better to burn out fighting than fade into nothing. Sarah felt his hand, or the memory of his hand, squeeze hers with desperate love. They had found each other again in death, and now they would face oblivion together, but not passively. They would rage against the dying of their light. "Can you do it?" Sarah asked Stone. The researcher nodded slowly. "I have equipment that can interface with the city's emergency broadcast system. If you channel all your remaining energy at once, we might be able to override every television, radio, and digital display in the metropolitan area simultaneously." Cole, despite his suspension, had been monitoring police communications. Now his voice crackled through Stone's radio. "Aldrich is holding a press conference tomorrow morning. He's going to announce Cole's suspension and discredit the entire investigation publicly." Perfect. They would hijack Aldrich's own moment of triumph, turning it into his exposure and downfall. Sarah looked at David, seeing her own determination reflected in his fading features. "Are you ready?" "Together," he whispered. "Always together." Around them, the cemetery began to vibrate with supernatural energy as they prepared to make their final stand. Every flower on every grave bloomed simultaneously, as if the dead were rising to witness this moment of ultimate justice. Tomorrow, they would either save the city from corruption or cease to exist entirely. But they would not go quietly into that dark night. Chapter 14, Revelation to the World. Mayor Thomas Aldrich's press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the City Hall auditorium, with full media coverage guaranteed by the promise of revelations about the disturbed detective who had been spreading conspiracy theories about municipal corruption. Aldrich stood at the podium in his finest suit, flanked by city officials and legal advisors, confident that he was about to permanently bury the investigation that threatened his empire. 3 blocks away, in Dr. Stone's office, the final battle between the living and the dead was about to begin. Sarah and David sat together, their forms now so translucent they were barely visible even to Stone's trained eyes. The energy required to maintain consciousness was nearly exhausted, but what remained burned with the intensity of stellar collapse. All their love, rage, and determination compressed into their final act of defiance. Stone had jury-rigged a complex array of electronic equipment, radio transmitters, computer interfaces, and signal boosters that could theoretically override the city's emergency broadcast system. But the power source would be something no engineer had ever imagined: the dying consciousness of murder victims demanding justice. "Are you certain about this?" Stone asked one final time. "Once you channel all your remaining energy, there won't be enough left to maintain coherence. This is irreversible." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "We know." David managed a fading smile. "Some things worth the cost." At precisely 10:03 a.m., as Aldrich began his carefully prepared statement about police misconduct and false accusations, every electronic display in the metropolitan area simultaneously went dark. Then Sarah Mitchell appeared on every screen. She looked as she had in life, vibrant, determined, alive with righteous anger. The energy expenditure was making her burn like a star, her image radiating with supernatural intensity that made viewers instinctively lean forward, transfixed by something their rational minds couldn't explain. "My name is Sarah Mitchell." Her voice echoed from thousands of speakers simultaneously. 7 days ago, I was murdered along with my fiancé, David Chun, to prevent us from exposing the corruption of Mayor Thomas Aldrich. In the City Hall auditorium, pandemonium erupted. Aldrich stepped back from the podium, his face pale with shock and terror. The assembled reporters forgot their professional composure, some screaming, others frantically trying to document what couldn't possibly be happening. Sarah continued, her image now joined by David's equally luminous presence. "We died because we discovered that Mayor Aldrich has stolen $12 million from programs meant to help the city's most vulnerable citizens. We died because we found evidence of systematic fraud, money laundering, and corruption that reaches the highest levels of government." Documents began materializing on screen: financial records, emails, photographs. recorded conversations. Every piece of evidence that Sarah and David had gathered was being broadcast simultaneously to hundreds of thousands of viewers. The man who killed us is Marcus Thorne, a professional assassin hired by Mayor Aldrich. You are about to hear his confession. Thorne's recorded admission played across the city, his voice clear and unmistakable as he detailed the contract killing of two innocent people whose only crime was seeking the truth. In the auditorium, Aldrich's lawyers were shouting about hoaxes and special effects, but their words were drowned out by the supernatural broadcast that was revealing decades of corruption in real time. Sarah felt her consciousness burning away like paper in flame, but she pressed on. This was their moment, their final chance to ensure that their deaths meant something. We cannot rest while our murderer remains free. David's voice joined hers, both of them now blazing with energy that was consuming their very existence. We cannot find peace while the man who ordered our deaths continues to profit from his crimes. Bank records appeared on screen showing offshore accounts filled with diverted city funds, video surveillance from Aldrich's meetings with Thorne, email exchanges discussing the journalist problem and permanent solutions. The broadcast reached its crescendo as Sarah used the last of her strength to project one final image, herself and David in life, happy and in love, their future stolen by a man's greed. "Remember us," she whispered, her voice beginning to fade. "Remember what we died for, and don't let our sacrifice be meaningless." The transmission ended abruptly, every screen in the city returning to normal programming, but the damage was done. The evidence was public, undeniable, and witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people. In Stone's office, two chairs sat empty where moments before two souls had made their final stand. The equipment smoked and sparked, overwhelmed by energies it was never designed to channel. Dr. Stone sat in stunned silence, mourning the loss of two remarkable spirits who had chosen annihilation over injustice. But outside, the city was awakening to the truth. Chapter 15, Justice and Dissolution. The supernatural broadcast reverberated through the city like a shock wave, its effects rippling outward in ways that defied Aldrich's ability to contain or control. Within hours, federal investigators had arrived to review the evidence that Sarah and David had died to reveal. The FBI opened a formal investigation into municipal corruption, while the state attorney general's office began preparing criminal charges. Detective Marcus Cole, vindicated by the ghostly testimony of the victims themselves, was reinstated with full honors and assigned to lead the expanded investigation. The recording of Thorne's confession, combined with the financial records broadcast across the city, provided an airtight case against both the assassin and his employer. Mayor Thomas Aldrich was arrested at his home at 6 p.m., charged with conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and fraud involving public funds. The man who had built his career on promises of transparency and accountability was led away in handcuffs before a crowd of reporters and protesters demanding justice. Marcus Thorne, faced with overwhelming evidence and no possibility of escape, agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty. His detailed confession implicated dozens of other officials in the corruption network, leading to the largest municipal scandal in the city's history. But for Dr. Rebecca Stone, sitting alone in her office, surrounded by silent equipment, the victory felt hollow. She had witnessed something unprecedented in her 15 years of research. Two souls choosing to burn themselves out of existence in a final act of justice. They had achieved their goal, but at the ultimate cost. The evening news carried wall-to-wall coverage of the arrests, the corruption revelations, and the impossible broadcast that had exposed it all. Editorial writers struggled to explain what they'd witnessed, while theologians and philosophers debated the implications of consciousness surviving death. But in the quiet moments between the media circus, Stone found herself thinking about two people who had loved each other enough to face oblivion together rather than let their murderer escape justice. She walked to Riverside Cemetery as the sun set, carrying flowers for two graves that had been hastily dug a week ago. The temporary markers had been replaced with proper headstones, paid for by grateful citizens who understood that Sarah Mitchell and David Chun had died as heroes. As Stone placed white lilies on Sarah's grave and red roses on David's, she felt a presence, not visible, not audible, but unmistakably there. A warmth in the cool evening air, a sense of peace that hadn't existed before. "Thank you," whispered a voice that might have been the wind, but carried the cadence of Sarah's speech. "The truth matters," came another whisper that sounded like David's gentle tone. Stone smiled through her tears. "You did it. You exposed the corruption. Aldrich will spend the rest of his life in prison." The presence seemed to shift, becoming lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted. In her peripheral vision, Stone thought she saw two figures walking hand in hand toward a light that seemed to shine from nowhere and everywhere at once. "We can go now," Sarah's voice carried on the evening breeze. "Together, always together," David's voice replied, fading into the distance. The temperature returned to normal, the sense of supernatural presence dissipated, and Stone was alone among the graves. But she wasn't sad. Sarah and David had found what they were looking for. Not just justice, but peace. They had completed their unfinished business and were finally free to continue their journey beyond the veil of death. The corruption network they died to expose was being dismantled piece by piece. The money would be recovered and returned to the programs that needed it. Future journalists would be safer because of their sacrifice. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of the physical world, two souls who had loved each other in life were together again, their mission complete and their rest finally earned. Chapter 16, Final Piece. 6 months after the supernatural broadcast that changed everything, the city had begun to heal from the wounds of systematic corruption. The trials of Mayor Aldrich and Marcus Thorne dominated headlines for weeks, resulting in convictions that would keep both men behind bars for the rest of their lives. Dozens of other officials were prosecuted, millions of stolen dollars were recovered, and new transparency measures were implemented to prevent future abuse. Detective Marcus Cole received commendations for his role in exposing the conspiracy, though he never spoke publicly about the impossible assistance he'd received from beyond the grave. Dr. Rebecca Stone published a carefully worded academic paper about consciousness persistence in cases of violent death, which became one of the most cited works in paranormal psychology, though she omitted the most dramatic details out of respect for Sarah and David's sacrifice. The city erected a memorial in Central Park honoring Sarah Mitchell and David Chun, recognizing them as journalists who died in pursuit of truth and justice. Fresh flowers appeared on their graves daily, left by citizens who understood that their freedom from corruption had been purchased with 2 lives and 2 souls. But for those who had witnessed the supernatural battle between good and evil, the most important victory was harder to quantify. In the quiet moments at dusk, in the peaceful spaces between heartbeats, there was a sense that the world had been set right, that justice had prevailed, and that love had proven stronger than death itself. Dr. Stone visited the cemetery on the anniversary of their deaths, carrying the same white lilies and red roses she'd brought that first evening. The headstones were weathered now, settled into the earth like old friends finding comfortable positions. She sat on the marble bench where she'd first met the impossible couple, thinking about consciousness and mortality and the thin boundaries between worlds. As the sun set behind the ancient oak tree, Stone felt a familiar warmth in the air, not the supernatural intensity of anchored souls fighting for justice, but something gentler, more peaceful. A presence that spoke of resolution and rest and eternal love. In the distance, she could have sworn she saw 2 figures walking hand in hand through the golden light of sunset, their forms translucent but unmistakably joyful. They paused at the crest of a hill, turned back as if to wave goodbye, and then continued on toward whatever lies beyond the horizon of human understanding. Sarah Mitchell and David Chun had found their peace at last. They had exposed the corruption that killed them, ensured that their murderer faced justice, and proven that some bonds transcend even death itself. Their unfinished business was complete. Their love story had reached its proper ending, and their souls were finally free to embark on whatever adventure awaited them in the undiscovered country from which no traveler returns. The city they died to protect was safer because of their sacrifice. The truth they'd fought to reveal was illuminating dark corners and preventing future victims. And somewhere beyond the veil of mortality, two souls who had thought death would separate them forever were together again, walking hand in hand into eternity. In the growing darkness of the cemetery, Dr. Stone sat surrounded by the quiet presence of the peaceful dead, grateful to have witnessed proof that love, truth, and justice are forces too powerful to be contained by the boundaries of physical existence. Some stories, she reflected, are too important to end with death. The wind rustled through the oak leaves with a sound like distant laughter, and for a moment, the scent of rain mingled with the fragrance of flowers. Not the violent storm that had accompanied their final night as living beings, but the gentle rain that washes the world clean and helps new growth begin. Sarah Mitchell and David Chun had thought they survived the crash until they saw their own bodies in the morgue. But in the end, they had survived something far more important than physical trauma. They had survived the ultimate test of love, courage, and commitment to justice, proving that some bonds are stronger than death, some truths are worth any sacrifice, and some victories are so complete they echo through eternity. Their story was finished, but their legacy would endure as long as people remembered that the dead do not always rest easy when injustice remains, and that love, true love, never truly dies. The end.